I could hear Lucas breathing heavily on the line, paralyzed by his cowardice. Before I could demand an explanation from him, there was a sharp rustle. Valerie stepped in. Her voice flooded the speaker, dripping with the artificial sugary sweetness she used to sell her ridiculous lifestyle coaching packages online. "Dad, please do not be upset with Lucas," Valerie cooed, lowering her tone into a patronizing register usually reserved for toddlers. "I is just overwhelmed right now. We have been talking about this for weeks. This is entirely for your own good. We are worried about you being out there alone." I stood in my living room, looking out the massive bay windows at the sprawling Montana landscape I had purchased with my own blood and sweat. "For my own good," I repeated softly. My voice was entirely flat. I did not raise it. I did not yell. My 42 years of calculating load-bearing walls had taught me one undeniable truth. When a structure is about to collapse, it always gives you warning signs. You just have to be quiet enough to hear them. Valerie took my calm demeanor as an invitation to push further. "Exactly, Dad. You are 76 years old. That is a very delicate age. You have 11 acres of land out there in Bozeman. It is simply too much for you to manage alone. What if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency and no one is around to call an ambulance? Lucas and I lose sleep worrying about your safety." It was a masterful performance. If a stranger had been listening, they would have thought Valerie was the most devoted daughter-in-law on the planet. But I was not a stranger. I was a structural engineer, and my mind automatically began stress-testing her narrative. The structural integrity of her lie was laughably weak. I was 76, but I chopped my own firewood. I hiked 2 miles every morning. I was in perfect health. Her sudden concern for my well-being felt incredibly hollow. "So your solution to my hypothetical medical emergency is to move Thomas and Susan into my house," I stated, presenting the raw data of her argument back to her. "Two people who have never lived outside a gated subdivision in California are going to move to a harsh Montana estate to become my caretakers. They want to do it, Dad." Valerie insisted, her pitch rising slightly as she rushed to patch the holes in her story. "My parents just sold their house in San Jose. They are looking for a fresh start. My father wants to get his hands dirty. He wants to take over the gardening and property maintenance. My mother wants to cook for you. We just want to merge our lives and be a big, happy family. You have been so lonely since Martha passed away. This will bring life back into the house." Hearing my late wife's name cross Valerie's lips felt like a physical blow to my chest. It took every ounce of self-control not to hang up the phone right then and there. My mind flashed back to a cold hospital room 5 years ago. Martha had been fading fast, her breathing shallow, but her mind remained as sharp as shattered glass. I remembered sitting beside her bed, holding her fragile hand. Martha had pulled me close, her eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, desperate intensity. "Watch Valerie, Rick," Martha had whispered, her voice raspy but firm. "Do not let her sweet act fool you. She looks at our things the way a vulture looks at a dying animal. She will consume our son, and when he has nothing left to give, she will come for you. Promise me you will not let her take what we built." This house was never just a meaningless arrangement of timber, stone, and mortar. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of our 40-year marriage, a towering architectural testament to the life Martha and I had painstakingly engineered from the ground up. When we first purchased these 11 acres, the land was wild and unforgiving. I spent 6 months meticulously analyzing the soil composition, calculating the exact frost line, and mapping the aggressive wind shear that ripped through the Montana Valley every winter. I poured a heavily reinforced concrete foundation designed to withstand seismic shifts, while Martha spent her weekends hand-selecting the massive old-growth pine logs that would eventually form our structural walls. We sanded the floors together until our hands bled breathing life into every single square inch of the estate. Now, looking around the grand living room, my eyes traced the intricate joinery of the vaulted ceilings and the precise placement of the custom bay windows that flooded the space with natural light. Every structural joint, every load-bearing beam was saturated with her memory. To Valerie, however, this architectural masterpiece was nothing more than a temporary hurdle, a pile of liquid assets waiting to be converted into cash to fund her grotesque artificial lifestyle. Her attempt at gaslighting was textbook, a highly calculated psychological stress test designed to systematically weaken my mental foundation. By weaponizing my grief and constantly reinforcing the narrative that I was a fragile, incompetent widower who was one bad fall away from a nursing home, she was applying a continuous uniform load of emotional pressure. She wanted to create micro-fractures in my confidence. She expected me to buckle, to doubt my own cognitive abilities, and to eventually surrender the keys to my kingdom out of sheer exhaustion. But she had fundamentally misunderstood the material she was trying to break. When you apply immense external pressure to a properly engineered support column, it does not shatter. The internal tension simply locks the steel rebar tighter into place. The promise I had made to Martha in that freezing hospital room 5 years ago acted as an unbreakable cross-bracing within my mind. I felt the last lingering traces of familial warmth evaporate, replaced instantly by the cold, unyielding rigidity of a man preparing for a war of attrition. I had promised her. Now, standing in the home Martha and I designed together, I watched the vultures circle overhead. Valerie was using my dead wife's memory as leverage, weaponizing my status as a widower to justify a blatant home invasion. It was a textbook gaslighting maneuver. She was trying to plant a seed of doubt in my mind, trying to make me feel old, frail, and incapable of managing my own life. "It is a lot of land," Valerie continued, sensing my silence and mistaking it for surrender. "We are trying to lift that burden off your shoulders, Dad. My parents arrive on the 28th. They are bringing a few things, but they will be so helpful. You can just relax and let them handle the heavy lifting. You deserve to rest." I closed my eyes and engaged my engineering mindset. When you discover a massive crack in a concrete foundation, you do not immediately swing a sledgehammer. You map the damage. You figure out exactly where the pressure is coming from. Thomas and Susan Baxter were arrogant, entitled people who looked down on anyone who worked with their hands. The idea of Thomas Baxter moving to Montana to shovel snow was statistically impossible. They were not coming to help me. They were coming to occupy my territory. If I yelled, if I threatened to call the police or lock the gates, Valerie would simply pivot. She would change her strategy, hide her true intentions, and attack from a different angle. I needed them out in the open. I needed them to bring their operation into my jurisdiction, where I could control the variables. To destroy a parasite, you must first invite it in and observe how it feeds. "I see," I said, my voice smooth and neutral. "Well, if Thomas is willing to handle the snowblower this winter, I suppose I could use the rest." I could practically hear Valerie smiling through the receiver. Her relief was palpable. The tension in her voice vanished, replaced by triumphant arrogance. "Oh, Dad, you are going to be so happy. We will see you soon, okay? Love you." "Goodbye, Valerie," I replied and calmly ended the call. I placed the phone down on the kitchen island. The peaceful retirement I had originally envisioned was completely over. A war had just been declared on my property, disguised as an act of familial charity. She had forgotten. My entire career was based on anticipating structural failures. She had offered me a plausible lie, a polished facade meant to conceal a decaying interior. I was not going to let them tear down my life. I was going to let them move in. I was going to let them unpack their bags, arrange their furniture, and believe they had won. I walked over to my desk, pulled out a fresh notepad, and picked up a heavy metal pen. I began to write down a precise, calculated schedule of events. If the Baxters were arriving on the 28th, I had exactly 3 weeks to prepare the site. 3 weeks to reinforce my legal boundaries and set a trap so devastating they would never recover. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, mechanical focus taking over my body. The blueprint for their absolute destruction was rapidly forming in my mind. 3 days after that phone call, the first physical violation of my property occurred. I was standing in the kitchen pouring my black coffee when I noticed movement at the edge of the driveway. 2 large unmarked white vans pulled through the iron gates of my estate. They drove slowly up the gravel path, parking near the eastern tree line. 4 men stepped out wearing bright orange visibility vests. They opened the rear doors and began unloading heavy plastic cases. My phone vibrated on the marble counter. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing, before answering with a mild tone. "Good morning, Valerie," I said. "Dad, good morning," she chirped, her voice vibrating with manufactured enthusiasm. "A landscaping crew is arriving at your house today. They might actually be pulling up right now. I hope they did not startle you." I looked out the window at the men assembling metal tripods. "Landscapers," I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "Yes," Valerie said, rushing to fill the silence. "You know how much my mother loves gardening. She has been talking non-stop about planting a massive rose garden near the east wing. Lucas and I thought it would be a wonderful surprise to have a professional team map out the soil before they arrive. It will make her feel at home. We already paid them, so you do not have to worry about a single thing. Just stay inside and let them do the dirty work." The manipulation was layered thickly. She was framing a blatant intrusion as a generous gift, tying it to her mother's fictitious love for roses to make any objection seem ungrateful. If I were the frail, lonely widower she needed me to be, I would have thanked her for her kindness. "That is very thoughtful of you, Valerie," I said, allowing a slight tremor of age to enter my voice. "You and Lucas are doing so much to prepare for the move. I will just stay inside and read my paper." "Oh, Dad, we are just happy to help," she replied, practically glowing through the receiver. "We just want you to be comfortable. See you soon." She ended the call. I placed the phone back on the counter. The polite, weary old man persona vanished the second the screen went dark. I set my mug down and walked out the front door, stepping into the crisp Montana air. I did not march toward the men with anger. I strolled toward them with the casual, harmless curiosity of a retired homeowner admiring the morning. As I approached the eastern tree line, my structural engineering background immediately processed the scene. These men were not analyzing soil acidity. They were not plotting dimensions for a flower bed. The plastic cases contained highly specialized equipment. I watched as the foreman secured a bright yellow robotic total station onto a heavy tripod. 2 other men were walking the far perimeter, holding GPS rover poles, looking closely. Another man was driving a steel rebar stake deep into the ground, with a mallet marking a precise coordinate. I spent 4 decades working alongside men exactly like this on commercial construction sites in Chicago. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were conducting a comprehensive commercial boundary survey. They were mapping the exact topographical coordinates of my 11-acre estate, determining elevation changes, right-of-way, access, and precise property lines. "Morning, gentlemen," I said, keeping my hands in my pockets as I walked up to the foreman. "You boys have some high-end gear there. That is a nice piece of equipment." The foreman looked up from his digital tablet. He was a younger man, sharp and professional. He eyed me politely, clearly assessing if I was going to be a problem. "Good morning, sir," he replied. "Yes, it gets the job done. We are just out here taking a few measurements. We will try to stay out of your way." "I appreciate that," I said, smiling warmly. "My daughter-in-law mentioned you were coming to map out a rose garden. I did not realize planting roses required a commercial-grade laser theodolite and satellite positioning. You must be planning one incredible garden." The foreman chuckled, looking confused. "Rose garden," he repeated, shaking his head. "I do not know anything about a garden, sir." The firm that hired us ordered a full commercial subdivision survey. We are marking out the boundaries to divide this parcel into a 1-acre residential plot and a 10-acre commercial zone. They needed the topographical maps expedited for county zoning approval. The air in my lungs turned to ice, but my facial expression remained a mask of pleasant ignorance. A commercial subdivision survey. The truth hit me with the devastating force of a collapsing steel beam. My own son and his wife were not just moving her broke parents into my home to keep me company. They were actively taking the legal steps to subdivide my property behind my back. You do not order an expedited commercial zoning survey unless you are preparing to sell, develop, or leverage the land for corporate capital. Well, I said, maintaining my gentle smile. You learn something new every day. I will let you boys get back to your math. Do not hesitate to knock on the door if you need any water. Thank you, sir, the foreman replied, turning his attention back to his blinking screen. I turned around and walked slowly back to my house. I did not rush. I did not let my shoulders tense. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a man who had nothing to worry about. But inside my mind, a violent storm of calculations was tearing through the final remnants of my familial trust. The plausible lie Valerie had constructed about her mother wanting a garden was completely fractured. It was a pathetic cover story meant to blindfold me while they measured my life for a coffin. I walked through the front door and locked it. I walked into my private study, sat down at my heavy oak desk, and stared at the framed photograph of Martha resting near my lamp. She had been right. She had seen the rot inside Valerie before I had the courage to acknowledge it. They were coming for everything. They were moving her parents into my home. They wanted to break my spirit and push my mental limits until I appeared incompetent. The commercial survey meant they already had a buyer or a bank lined up. They were mapping the boundaries to sever the land, planning to throw me into a facility while they cashed in on my life's work. My footsteps were slow, deliberate, and entirely silent as I walked across the hardwood floors, maintaining the perfect physical illusion of a harmless, ignorant retiree, completely oblivious to the blade being pressed against his throat. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior, my mind was operating at a terrifying, hyper-accelerated velocity, processing the raw data of their treason. 4 decades of managing massive commercial construction grids in downtown Chicago made it impossible for me to misinterpret the visual evidence I had just witnessed at the edge of the tree line. The bright yellow robotic total station, the satellite positioning poles, the heavy rebar stakes driven into the frost-hardened earth. These were not the tools of a casual landscaping crew preparing a fictitious rose garden for Susan Baxter. They were the precise mathematical instruments of legal severance. The realization hit me with the crushing, catastrophic force of a collapsing suspension bridge. To order an expedited commercial-grade topographical survey of this magnitude meant that Valerie and Lucas had already bypassed the theoretical planning phase of their betrayal. They were in the final active stages of execution. They were legally dissecting my 11 acres, mapping the exact zoning coordinates required to sever the property lines. You only commission this specific type of municipal mapping if you are preparing to leverage the raw land for a massive influx of corporate capital, or if you have already secured a commercial buyer who demands flawless boundary warranties. The sheer audacity of the logistical timeline took my breath away. They were not merely planning to move her bankrupt, arrogant parents into my guest suites to make me miserable. The Baxters were simply the psychological battering ram. Their job was to invade my sanctuary, disrupt my daily routines, and agitate me until I exhibited the very symptoms of cognitive decline Valerie needed to legally declare me incompetent. Once my medical power of attorney was seized, the commercial subdivision would be instantly finalized. The land would be liquidated, and I would be quietly erased, locked away in an underfunded state-run facility to wither under heavy sedation. The betrayal was so absolute, so structurally profound, that it instantly severed any remaining paternal bond I held for my son. Lucas was no longer a family member. He was a critically compromised rivet in my life's architecture, a fatal liability that threatened to bring my entire world crashing down. I locked the heavy oak door of my study, the initial wave of shock entirely gone, replaced by a glacial, methodical fury. I was going to engineer a trap so deeply embedded in their own greed that they would never see the ground opening up beneath their feet. I pulled my notepad back to the center of the desk. My hands were perfectly steady. The initial shock was completely replaced by a cold, calculating wrath. The first physical violation of my property had occurred, and the enemy believed they had operated undetected. I picked up my pen, pressed the tip against the paper, and began to outline the secret actions I would take tonight to dismantle their future. I would not let them win. I would break them completely instead. Friday evening arrived with the crunch of tires on gravel. I watched from the kitchen window as Lucas and Valerie pulled up in their leased luxury SUV. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump a fraction of an inch. I softened my gaze, preparing to play the frail old man they needed me to be. When I opened the heavy front door, Valerie bounded up the steps with a theatrical smile, carrying a clipboard. Lucas trailed behind her, carrying 2 bags and keeping his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. Valerie threw her arms around me, engulfing me in overpowering perfume. "Dad! It is so good to see you," she exclaimed loudly. "We are so excited to get this house ready for my parents. There is so much to do, but we are going to handle all the heavy lifting." "Thank you, Valerie," I replied intentionally, letting my voice sound breathless. "I appreciate you both coming. It is a big house for one old man." Lucas reached the porch looking terrible. His face was pale, his jaw tense. "Hi, Dad," he muttered, brushing past me to drop the bags inside. He did not hug me. He avoided my gaze. As a structural engineer, I spent my life identifying stress fractures. Looking at my 42-year-old son, I saw a man buckling under a massive invisible weight. He had no tensile strength left, entirely compromised by the woman beside him. Valerie did not waste a second. She marched toward the East Wing guest suites. I shuffled after them, maintaining my harmless pace. Entering the primary guest room, Valerie began waving her hands, dictating changes like a demolition foreman. "This space has good bones, but it is too dark," Valerie announced, tapping her clipboard. She walked to the massive mahogany armoire in the corner. "This piece has to go, Dad. It is too depressing. My mother needs airy energy. We should donate it." That armoire was a mid-century antique Martha had spent months tracking down. She polished it herself. Valerie knew what that piece meant to me. It was a calculated test of my boundaries, a deliberate psychological strike to see how much territory she could claim without resistance. I felt a cold spike of anger hit my chest, but I quickly smothered it with pure logic. Anger is an undisciplined emotion. It clouds judgment. I needed to keep my mind completely clear. I looked at the armoire, then looked at Valerie, and offered a mild, agreeable nod. "If you think that is best for Susan," I said softly, "I suppose I can have some men move it to the storage shed next week. I would not want your mother to feel cramped." Valerie's eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction. She had pushed the boundary, and I had retreated. "Perfect," she said, scribbling a note on her clipboard. "And these heavy velvet curtains need to come down immediately. They smell like old dust. We will bring some modern sheer panels when we drive up with the moving truck." I spent the next 2 hours following them around my own house, nodding politely, as Valerie verbally dismantled the home Martha and I had built. She criticized the layout of the dining room, claiming the dining table was too large and imposing. She inspected the kitchen appliances, loudly whispering to Lucas that they would need to upgrade the refrigerator because her parents required specialized organic diets. Lucas simply nodded along, looking physically ill. When it was time for dinner, I prepared a simple roast chicken. We sat around the large dining table that Valerie had just deemed obsolete. Lucas barely touched the food. Instead, he poured himself a glass of scotch from my liquor cabinet. He finished it in 3 long swallows and immediately poured a second. His hands were shaking slightly. "How is work going, Lucas?" I asked, testing the waters. "Are you still managing that commercial real estate portfolio?" Lucas choked on his scotch, coughing into his napkin. His eyes darted to Valerie in sheer panic. He wiped at his mouth and his face turning a deep shade of red. "It is fine, Dad. Work is fine. Just the usual market fluctuations. Nothing I cannot handle." "Lucas has been working incredibly hard," Valerie interrupted swiftly, placing a manicured hand over his. "In fact, he has been so stressed that my parents moving in will actually be a blessing for us too. We will not have to worry about you being out here all alone, which means Lucas can focus entirely on his investments. I looked at my son. The man was sweating through his expensive dress shirt. He took another gulp of his drink, staring fixedly at his plate. The cowardice was staggering. He was sitting at my table, eating my food actively, participating in a plot to steal my property, and he did not even have the spine to look his father in the eye. The atmospheric pressure inside the dining room was so incredibly dense, it felt as though the oxygen had been entirely sucked out of the room, leaving behind a suffocating vacuum of deceit and unspoken hostility. I sat at the head of the massive custom-built dining table, the very table Valerie had just moments ago declared obsolete and imposing, and observed the grotesque theatrical performance playing out in front of me. I had spent the afternoon slow roasting a chicken, filling the house with a rich, savory aroma, but the food on my plate tasted like ash. My attention was entirely fixed on the catastrophic structural failure sitting to my left. Lucas, my 42-year-old son, the boy I had spent a lifetime protecting and providing for, was actively disintegrating before my eyes. As an engineer, I was trained to look for visual indicators of stress, the hairline fractures in concrete, the slight bowing of a steel joist, the flaking paint around a joint, carrying too much weight. Lucas was exhibiting every single sign of an imminent catastrophic collapse. He was sweating profusely, the moisture blooming through the collar of his expensive tailored dress shirt. His hands shook with such violent, uncontrollable tremors that the ice in his Scotch glass rattled loudly against the crystal every time he lifted it to his lips. I was consuming the heavy liquor not for the taste, but as a desperate chemical reinforcement to keep his shattered nerves from completely giving out. When I casually inquired about his commercial real estate portfolio, the sheer terror that flashed across his pale face was absolute. The pathetic, stammering lie that tumbled from his mouth about market fluctuations possessed zero structural integrity. He choked on his drink, his eyes darting wildly to Valerie, silently begging his puppet master to step in and save him from his own father's mild questioning. And Valerie, ever the apex predator, swooped in flawlessly. She placed her perfectly manicured predatory hand over his trembling fingers, anchoring him while she spun a dizzying web of lies about how hard he had been working and how her parents' arrival would be a blessing for his stress levels. The sheer, unadulterated cowardice radiating from my son was nauseating. He was sitting in the very house I built, eating the food I prepared, actively harboring the forged documents that would sign my life away, and he lacked the fundamental spinal fortitude to even make eye contact with me. It was a chilling confirmation of his true nature. Whatever paternal guilt or hesitation I might have subconsciously harbored was permanently eradicated at that table. He was a willing parasite, and I was going to exterminate him. I felt a profound sense of disappointment, but it solidified my resolve. Any lingering paternal guilt evaporated right then. He had chosen his side. After dinner, the psychological warfare escalated. We moved to the living room. I sat in my leather recliner. Valerie stood in the center of the room, her hands on her hips, evaluating the space. "You know, Dad," Valerie began, her voice dropping into that fake soothing register again. I was thinking about the stairs. As you get older, navigating that massive oak staircase every night might become a hazard. Your knees are not what they used to be." My knees were perfectly fine. I could jog up those stairs without losing my breath. "What are you suggesting, Valerie?" I asked calmly. "Well, the ground floor office has a lovely view of the pines," she said casually, as if she were suggesting what to watch on television. "We could easily convert that into a primary bedroom for you. It would be so much safer. Then my parents could have the entire upstairs master suite. They have so many belongings, and they really need the space to feel comfortable." She was proposing that I give up my master bedroom, the room I had shared with Martha for decades, and move myself into a small converted office in my own house. The audacity was breathtaking. She was openly telling me that I was becoming a secondary citizen on my own property. She was laying the psychological groundwork to strip me of my authority piece by piece, room by room, until I had nothing left. That is quite a structural change, I replied, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Moving out of the master suite is a big adjustment. Of course, Dad, she smiled, patting my shoulder. No rush. We just want what is best for your health. She walked down the hallway toward the guest wing, signaling to Lucas. He stood up slowly, bringing his scotch bottle. He looked back at me for a fraction of a second before disappearing down the hall. I sat entirely alone in my chair, listening to the silence. They thought they were architects of my demise, but they were walking straight into a meticulously engineered trap tonight. The house was silent at 2 a.m. An unnatural sound woke me. A sharp, metallic click echoed from the hallway of the West Wing, which housed my private study. It was a room I kept strictly off-limits and firmly locked. I lay perfectly still in the dark, analyzing the acoustic signature. It was not the settling of old timber. It was the precise scrape of metal against metal. Someone was manipulating a lock tumbler. I slid out of bed, my bare feet silent against the hardwood. I moved down the corridor with the steady pace of a man inspecting a compromised foundation. As I approached the heavy oak door of my study, I noticed yellow light bleeding out from underneath the threshold. The door was supposed to be deadbolted. I grasped the brass handle and turned it slowly. It yielded without resistance. I pushed the door open. Valerie froze instantly. She was standing in front of my massive steel filing cabinet. One of the heavy drawers was pulled wide open. In her left hand, she held a tactical flashlight. In her right hand, she held a tension wrench and a lockpick. She had bypassed a commercial-grade deadbolt to gain entry. The silence in the room was heavy. But Valerie was a seasoned manipulator. The shock on her face lasted 3 seconds before she constructed a new facade. "Oh, Dad," she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "You scared me half to death. I did not expect you to be awake at this hour." I stepped into the room, my mind operating with lethal precision. "What are you doing in my study, Valerie?" I asked. My voice was completely devoid of anger. I simply presented the question as a request for data. She dropped the lockpick into her pocket, but she could not hide the open filing cabinet. "Well, the house felt incredibly drafty," she said, her voice adopting a patronizingly sweet tone. Lucas and I were freezing. I wanted to check the heating system, but I could not find the thermostat manual. I remembered you kept house documents in here, so I came looking for the warranty to see if there was a troubleshooting guide. I just wanted to help. I looked at the open drawer. It was labeled for property taxes and estate deeds. The structural integrity of her excuse was laughably weak. It was an insult to my intelligence. I systematically dismantled her lie using pure logic. "The heating system was installed 5 years ago," I stated mildly. "The warranty expired 3 years ago. The thermostat is a smart device controlled entirely through an application on my phone. There is no paper manual. Furthermore, the guest room temperature is controlled by an independent dial located right next to your bed." She shifted her weight, scrambling to patch the holes in her story. "I suppose I did not see the dial in the dark," she offered. "You really should not leave this door unlocked, Dad. Anyone could wander in here." "I locked this door at 9 o'clock tonight," I replied calmly. "And I am quite certain I saw you slip a tension wrench into your pocket. Did you pick the lock on my private office to find a digital warranty for a thermostat? You did not need to adjust." The logical cornering broke her composure. The sugary sweetness vanished. She realized she could not outsmart me with facts, so she pivoted to emotional warfare. Her eyes brimmed with sudden manufactured tears. "I cannot believe you are accusing me of breaking and entering," she cried out, intentionally raising her volume so her voice carried down the hallway. "I am here trying to help you prepare your home, and you are standing here interrogating me like a criminal. You are getting paranoid, Dad." The volume of her voice achieved its intended goal. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. Lucas appeared in the doorway wearing sweatpants and rubbing his tired eyes. He looked from me to Valerie, What is going on in here? Lucas asked, his voice thick with sleep. Why is everyone yelling? Valerie rushed to his side, clutching his arm and burying her face against his shoulder. Lucas, your father is acting completely irrational, she sobbed. I came in here looking for the heater instructions because I was cold and the door was wide open. But he cornered me. He is accusing me of picking locks. It is terrifying. Lucas wrapped an arm around her, glaring at me with a mixture of exhaustion and misplaced anger. Dad, what is wrong with you? He demanded. Valerie is trying to help. You need to calm down. Your mind is playing tricks on you again. The doctor said the heart attack could cause episodes of confusion. You cannot just go around attacking the people who are trying to care for you. I stood there looking at my son. He was defending the woman who burglarized my office, using my medical history to gaslight me. They were building a narrative of my mental decline. If I pointed out the open drawer of tax documents, they would simply spin it as a paranoid delusion. I realized fighting them now would only reveal my full awareness. I needed them to feel completely safe in their deception. I let out a heavy sigh, allowing my shoulders to slump. I brought a trembling hand to my forehead, rubbing my temples as if fighting a severe headache. I looked at the floor, projecting total defeat. I apologize, I said, my voice wavering slightly. You are right, Lucas. It is very late. The shadows in this room confused me. I woke up disoriented. I thought I heard something else. I am just so tired. I am sorry, Valerie. I did not mean to frighten you. Please go back to bed. I will secure the office. Valerie peeked out from Lucas's shoulder, her eyes analyzing my posture. When she saw the submission in my body language, a victorious smirk touched the corners of her mouth. She had won the skirmish. She successfully turned my own son against me and reinforced the illusion of my declining sanity. It is okay, Dad, Valerie whispered, projecting forced sympathy. We know you are not yourself lately. We just want you to rest. Come on, Lucas. Let us get back to sleep. Lucas gave me one last disappointed look before guiding Valerie out of the room. I watched them walk down the hallway until they disappeared into the guest wing. I waited until I heard their door click shut. The silence returned to the house, heavy and absolute. I turned back to the massive steel filing cabinet. I felt dangerously clear and completely awake. I reached deep into the open drawer and ran my fingers over my property deed and tax files. She had been searching for the financial documents required to finalize their fraudulent commercial loan. She had been hunting for the final piece of the puzzle to steal my estate. They believed they had easily outsmarted a confused old man tonight. They did not realize they had just given me the exact blueprints to orchestrate their absolute destruction. Sunday morning arrived with the suffocating smell of bacon and artificial sweetness. Valerie insisted on cooking a massive family breakfast before they drove back to the city, attempting to maintain her facade of absolute domestic perfection. I sat at the head of the dining table, sipping my black coffee, playing the role of the exhausted, grateful father-in-law. Lucas stared at his plate, nursing a severe hangover and avoiding my gaze entirely. He looked physically ill, jumping at every sudden noise in the kitchen. Valerie, however, chatted endlessly about how excited her parents were to move into the guest wing next month. She went over her ridiculous list of changes one more time, reminding me that the antique armoire would be moved on Tuesday, and that she had ordered new curtains for the living room. I nodded slowly, offering a weak smile, and agreeing to every single demand. When they finally loaded their bags into their leased luxury vehicle, Valerie gave me another suffocating hug. Lucas managed a stiff handshake and a muted goodbye. I stood on the porch and waved until their vehicle disappeared down the long gravel driveway. The moment the dust settled on the road, my frail posture vanished entirely. I stood up straight, rolled my shoulders back, and walked directly to my private study. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and walked over to the massive steel filing cabinet sitting in the corner of the room. 42 years of designing skyscrapers in Chicago had wired my brain to operate on absolute precision. I do not simply place important documents into a drawer and forget about them. I index them with meticulous care. Every single file folder in that cabinet was aligned with a specific measured tension block to keep the papers perfectly upright. I pulled my keys from my pocket, unlocked the mechanism, and opened the heavy metal drawer containing my estate planning property deeds and tax assessments. My eyes immediately locked onto the primary structural flaw. The thick manila folder holding the original deed to my 11-acre property had been shifted. It was no longer pressed flush against the rear tension block. It had been moved forward by exactly 2 full inches. I closed my eyes and visualized the layout of the documents from the last time I opened this drawer. Behind the deed were the current zoning permits and the municipal tax evaluations. I reached in and examined the edges of the paper. They were slightly ruffled, the crisp corners bent just a fraction of a millimeter. Valerie had not just been looking for a thermostat warranty in the dark. She had been photographing my financial architecture. She had pulled the deed, the zoning permits, and the tax records, likely scanning them with the camera on her phone before I caught her picking the lock. I let out a slow, deeply controlled breath into the quiet room. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and pressed my hands flat against the cool wood. I did not cry. I did not feel the urge to break anything. The emotional devastation of my own son betraying me had already been processed and discarded the night before. Lucas was a coward, completely consumed by a woman who viewed my life work as nothing more than a bank account waiting to be drained. What remained in my mind was pure, cold, calculating engineering logic. You need 3 specific things to secure a massive commercial loan against a piece of property. You need the original deed information, you need the municipal tax assessments to prove the property value, and you need the signature of the legal owner. Valerie had spent the night gathering the first 2 items. The fact that the commercial surveyors had already mapped my land meant the fraudulent loan application was already in motion. They were not just planning to move her broke parents into my guest rooms to annoy me. They were using my 11 acres as collateral for a massive sum of money. And to finalize that transaction without my consent, they needed me out of the picture permanently. They needed to declare me mentally incompetent so Lucas could seize medical and financial power of attorney, allowing them to sign the final banking approvals. They wanted a war over real estate. I decided right then and there that I would build them a slaughterhouse to end this miserable charade. To dismantle an enemy operation, you need uninterrupted intelligence. I needed to know exactly how far along they were in their banking fraud and exactly what their timeline was. I could not rely on guessing or intuition. I needed to hear their unedited conversations when they thought they were completely alone in my house. I grabbed my keys, walked out to the garage, and got into my heavy-duty pickup truck. I did not drive to the local hardware store in Bozeman. People in town knew me. If anyone saw me buying surveillance equipment, word would eventually get back to Lucas. Instead, I merged onto the interstate and drove 2 towns over, putting 50 miles between my property and my destination. I drove with the radio off, running through the legal and financial calculations in my head. I pulled into the parking lot of a high-end tactical electronics supply store. It was a discreet establishment, the kind of place private investigators and security contractors frequented for highly specialized gear and devices. I walked inside and approached the glass counter. I asked the clerk for the smallest, most advanced audio surveillance equipment they had in stock. I specified that I needed devices with extended battery life, high-definition digital storage and voice-activated sensors so they would not waste memory recording empty rooms. The clerk showed me a set of military-grade micro-audio recorders. They were no larger than a standard coin, completely black, and designed to blend into dark spaces. I purchased 3 of them. I paid for the equipment entirely in cash to ensure there would be no paper trail on my bank statements that Valerie or Lucas could ever track down. I walked back to my truck and placed the small plastic shopping bag on the passenger seat. As I drove the 50 miles back to my estate, my mind felt incredibly sharp. The enemy thought they had successfully infiltrated my entire fortress. They thought they had bypassed my security, stolen the blueprints to my life, and set the stage for my quiet removal. They believed I was just a tired old man fading into the background of my own home. They had absolutely no idea that they had just activated a veteran structural engineer who knew exactly how to identify their weak points. I was about to wire my entire house to capture every single word of their conspiracy, gathering the exact evidence I needed to bring their entire lives crashing down directly on top of their heads. I would not simply defend my home. I would ensure they never attempted to exploit another human being ever again. I pulled through my front gates perfectly, ready to begin the final phase of my quiet, devastating, and absolutely methodical preparation. The gravel crunched under the tires of my truck as I pulled into the garage and cut the engine. I sat in absolute silence for a full minute. My eyes remained fixed on the plastic bag resting on the passenger seat. Inside were the instruments of defense. 3 military-grade micro-audio recorders. They were barely the size of a standard quartercast in matte black to avoid reflection. The clerk at the tactical supply store assured me their voice activation sensors were highly calibrated. They would not waste batteries recording the hum of a refrigerator. They would only capture human voices. I stepped out of the truck and locked the deadbolt behind me. I approached my home not as a resident, but as an engineer auditing a compromised building. To capture the raw data of their conspiracy, I needed optimal acoustic placement. I needed locations where sound waves propagated naturally without interference from ambient noise. I also needed to ensure the devices were completely invisible to a woman who had already demonstrated a willingness to pick locks. I walked into the main living room. The grand space featured a vaulted ceiling and a massive stone fireplace. Valerie had announced her intention to rearrange this room. If I placed a recorder under a piece of furniture she deemed obsolete, it might be discovered during their redecorating spree. I looked up at the air conditioning return grate, located high on the eastern wall. It was positioned directly above the seating area. I retrieved my stepladder and a magnetic screwdriver. I climbed carefully, making sure my movements were precise. I removed the 4 screws holding the painted metal grate in place and gently pulled it away from the wall. The ductwork was lined with fine dust. I wiped a small section clean. I took the first micro-recorder, peeled the backing off its adhesive strip, and pressed it firmly against the upper interior wall of the metal duct. It was positioned deep enough that a flashlight beam would not catch it, but close enough to the opening to capture every whisper spoken below. I replaced the grate, tightening the screws to their original tension so the paint lines matched perfectly. 1 zone was secure. 2 remained. I walked toward the guest wing. This was the territory Valerie claimed for her parents. The air in this corridor felt tainted by the memory of her entitlement. I entered the primary guest bedroom. This was where she and Lucas would sleep when they returned this weekend. The room was spacious, dominated by a large 4-poster bed and the antique mahogany armoire she ordered me to throw away. I knew she would be opening drawers and inspecting closets, looking for any excuse to throw out my late wife's belongings. I simply needed a location she would never examine. I looked at the heavy brass chandelier suspended from the center of the ceiling. It was an ornate fixture with a wide decorative canopy resting flush against the drywall. I positioned my ladder beneath it and climbed up. I loosened the brass canopy ring just enough to slide my fingers inside the small gap between the fixture and the ceiling box. I activated the second recorder and slipped it into the dark cavity, letting its magnetic backing snap silently against the metal junction box. I tightened the canopy ring back into place. From the floor, the chandelier looked completely undisturbed, but from that elevated vantage point, the device would act as a perfect acoustic funnel, capturing every late-night argument and whispered strategy they uttered behind closed doors. I stepped down from the ladder and returned it to the garage. I held the third and final recorder in the palm of my hand. I walked into the kitchen. This was the command center of the house. The large marble island was where Valerie liked to lean and dictate her plans while sipping her expensive bottled water. It was where Lucas poured his scotch and avoided eye contact. I needed to capture their morning conversations, the unguarded moments when they thought I was still asleep. I knelt on the hardwood floor and inspected the underside of the heavy oak dining table adjacent to the kitchen island. The table had a thick central pedestal base. I crawled completely underneath it, lying flat on my back. I found a hollow groove carved into the interior of the wooden support structure. I pressed the third recorder deep into the recess, ensuring the adhesive bonded tightly with the rough wood. It was entirely out of sight. Even if someone dropped a fork and bent down to retrieve it, the device was hidden within the shadow of the pedestal. The physical installation was complete, but I needed to verify the system integrity. I walked back to my private study, locked the door, and opened the encrypted application I had downloaded onto my phone at the tactical supply store. The software interface was clean and utilitarian. 3 green indicators illuminated on my screen, confirming all 3 devices were active and properly synced to my private network. I needed to test the audio calibration. I walked back out to the living room, stood in the center of the space, and spoke in a normal conversational volume. "Testing zone 1, I said to the empty room. I walked to the guest wing, stood beneath the chandelier, and whispered, "Testing zone 2. Finally, I went to the kitchen, stood near the marble island, and muttered, "Testing zone 3. I returned to my study and refreshed the application. 3 new audio files had populated in my secure inbox. I pressed play on the first file. My own voice echoed through my phone speaker, crisp and entirely clear. The trap was flawlessly set. The digital net was cast wide across my entire property, securing every single vulnerability. I sat back in my heavy desk chair and looked at the small blinking green lights on my screen. I felt a profound sense of isolation. But it was not the lonely isolation of a grieving widower longing for the past. It was the cold, calculated isolation of a military commander preparing for an inevitable siege. My son and his wife were driving back to Bozeman this coming weekend. They were coming to measure my house for my own coffin. They would walk through the front doors wearing their fake smiles and offering their empty, patronizing concerns. And every time they opened their mouths to plot my institutionalization, my digital witnesses would capture their treason. I did not feel sorrow for Lucas. A man who allows his wife to forge financial documents against his own family estate has forfeited his right to paternal protection. I was no longer his father in any meaningful sense of the word. I was simply the final immovable obstacle standing directly between them and their stolen millions. I plugged my phone into the wall charger and watched the screen fade to black. The physical perimeter of my home was secure. The digital surveillance network was fully operational. The only thing left to do was to wait patiently and let them talk themselves straight into a federal prison. Rain hammered against the estate windows. Lucas and Valerie arrived complaining about the mud. I served dinner keeping my head bowed, letting my hands tremble when I poured the coffee. I excused myself early. I locked my bedroom door and waited 45 minutes for the house to quiet down. I slipped out the side door into the unheated, freezing garage. I climbed into my dark truck. I did not start the engine. I simply sat in the absolute darkness, wrapped in a thick wool coat, and pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened the encrypted audio application. 3 green indicators confirmed a secure connection. I tapped the icon for Zone 2, the micro recorder hidden securely inside the brass canopy of the chandelier in the primary guest bedroom. I heard a zipper pulled open and a suitcase hitting the mattress. Then Valerie spoke. Her voice dropped the sugary tone. It was sharp and laced with absolute panic. "Pull yourself together immediately." "Lucas," she hissed, pacing across the hardwood. "You were sweating through your shirt at the dinner table like a guilty child waiting to be punished. If he notices you are nervous, the timeline gets compromised. Stop acting like a coward." I heard the sound of liquid sloshing into a glass. Lucas had brought his scotch into the bedroom. I cannot keep doing this. Valerie, Lucas replied, his voice cracking with a pathetic, hollow desperation. Sitting across from him, eating the food he cooked while we are doing this. It is making me physically sick to my stomach. He is my father. He built this place. Valerie let out a cruel laugh that echoed chillingly through the speaker of my phone. Your father is a stepping stone, she snapped. He has lived his life. We have 30 years left, and we are currently staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. You can afford to feel guilty when our bank accounts are not frozen. Right now, you need to focus on the objective. I leaned my head back against the cold leather headrest of my truck. The audio feed was crystal, every syllable cut through the silent garage. We are bringing my parents here in exactly 2 weeks, Valerie continued, her voice dropping into a harsh, commanding whisper. We do not have the luxury of delaying this move. I still do not understand why your parents have to move here right now. Lucas argued, the alcohol clearly emboldening him slightly. We are already managing too many moving parts. Adding 2 more people to this house only complicates the logistics. Why could they not just stay in California until we finalize the banking paperwork? The silence on the recording lasted for 5 grueling seconds. When Valerie finally spoke, the truth dropped like a heavy steel beam. Because they do not have a house anymore, Lucas. The bank foreclosed on the San Jose property on Tuesday morning. They are completely broke. They have absolutely nothing left. I closed my eyes in the dark cab of the truck. The grand story of Thomas and Susan selling their luxurious estate to seek a quiet life in Montana was a complete fabrication. They were bankrupt. The arrogant, boastful people who constantly sneered at my working-class background had run their own finances straight into the ground. They were not coming here to garden or cook. They were fleeing creditors and seeking a free sanctuary on my property. Foreclosed. Lucas gasped. His breathing became erratic, his panic amplifying through the hidden microphone. Valerie, you told me they had equity in that house. You told me they were going to help us cover the interest payments on the margin loan. I lied. She snapped back instantly, without a single shred of remorse. I lied, because if I told you the truth, you would have completely fallen apart, just like you are doing right now. They are broke, Lucas. Just like we are broke. The desperation in the guest bedroom reached a boiling point. We are worse than broke, Valerie, Lucas shouted, his voice muffled, as if he had buried his face in his hands to contain the noise. We are $500,000 in the hole. $500,000. How could you let your brother talk us into that offshore investment scheme? It was a complete fraud. The money is gone. The offshore accounts vanished. And the private lenders your brother used are demanding their capital back by the end of the month. They are threatening and freeze everything we own. I sat perfectly still in the freezing truck. The structural foundation of their lives had completely collapsed. A $500,000 debt to private, dangerous lenders, a fraudulent offshore investment, broke, desperate in-laws fleeing foreclosure. The entire facade of their wealthy, successful lifestyle was a house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind. I know what the deadline is, Lucas, Valerie said coldly, asserting her dominance. That is exactly why my parents are moving in. We need them here to accelerate the process. The more crowded this house feels, the more stressed the old man gets. My mother will constantly rearrange his kitchen. My father will take over his television and smoke in the living room. We will disrupt his sleep schedule. We will push his mental limits until he snaps. The doctor we paid in Bozeman already agreed that a sudden change in his environment will easily trigger the symptoms of severe cognitive decline we need for the evaluation. The sheer malice in her voice was breathtaking. She was not just planning to steal from me. She was actively designing a psychological torture chamber inside my own home, utilizing her bankrupt parents as the instruments of my mental destruction. And once the doctor signs the incompetence declaration, she continued smoothly, you automatically trigger the medical power of attorney. We finalize the commercial loan against this land. We pay off the $500,000 debt, and we are completely free. I reached out and turned the volume down slightly on my phone. The truth was entirely exposed. The commercial survey I had witnessed days prior was the prerequisite for their exit strategy. They forged my signature to secure a massive commercial loan against my estate. They needed me declared legally incompetent, so Lucas could step in as my financial proxy to execute the final banking approvals before their private lenders destroyed them. I pressed the power button on my phone, cutting the audio feed. The recording was safely stored on my secure digital cloud. I sat in the silent, freezing garage for a long time. I did not feel an ounce of sorrow for my son. He was a willing participant in my execution. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold air. The enemy was desperate, drowning in debt and running out of time. They were operating on a strict deadline, which meant they were about to become incredibly sloppy. I unlocked my truck, stepped out into the garage, and walked into the house. I had all the data I needed. It was time to build the slaughterhouse. I locked the door of my private study and sat at my desk. My blood ran completely cold. I pressed the power button on my phone and resumed the audio file from Zone 2. Valerie was pacing across the bedroom floor. "Lucas," she said, her tone devoid of empathy. "The private lenders gave us until the end of the month. That is why we submitted the commercial loan application last Tuesday." "What if the bank verifies the signature?" Lucas asked, trembling. "What if they call him?" "They will not call him," Valerie replied sharply. "I already intercepted the contact information. I forwarded the verification emails to a secure domain. As for the signature, it was incredibly simple. I pulled his old tax returns from the cabinet last month. I scanned the original ink and overlaid his exact signature onto the commercial collateral documents. The underwriter already approved the file. We are holding a $2.5 million commercial loan in escrow against this estate. My own daughter-in-law had committed federal wire fraud. She had leveraged my property to bail out her husband from a fraudulent investment. But we cannot access the escrow funds until we have unquestionable legal authority over his assets," Valerie continued. "The title company requires a notarized medical proxy to release the capital. That is why my parents are moving into this house. We are going to disrupt his routine and isolate him. The doctor we paid will document his rapid cognitive decline. Once he signs the incompetence declaration, you become his legal guardian. We sign the final release. The bank wires the $2.5 million, and we pay off the offshore lenders." Lucas let out a ragged exhale. "And what happens to my father after we take the money?" Valerie did not hesitate. "We sell the entire estate to that corporate developer from Seattle," she stated coldly. "They already offered $5 million cash for the raw land. They want to bulldoze this log cabin and build a luxury mountain resort. We clear our debts, keep the remaining $2.5 million, and move back to California." "And my father," Lucas repeated. "He goes into the state-funded care facility in Billings," Valerie answered. "They take Medicare. It is cheap. It is secure. He will be heavily medicated anyway. He will not even know what city he is in. We cannot be burdened with managing a dementia patient while we rebuild our lives. He has lived his time. It is our turn to survive." The facility she mentioned was notorious for abysmal conditions. It was a place where forgotten people were left to wither away in dark, understaffed corridors. She had actively sought out the absolute cheapest institution in the state to maximize her profit margins. I waited for my son to object. I waited for him to defend the father who had spent 42 years breaking his back to give him a privileged life. "Okay," Lucas finally whispered. "We stick to the timeline. We move your parents in on the 28th. I stopped the recording. The audio file was the most unforgivable betrayal I had ever witnessed. They had financed their survival with my execution. They were going to throw me into a miserable, underfunded ward to rot under heavy sedation, believing I had lost my mind while they lived on my millions. I did not shed a tear in the dark. I did not feel a sudden pang of sorrow. When a heavy steel beam snaps under immense pressure, You do not sit down and mourn the broken metal. You completely replace it. Lucas was no longer a family member. I was a highly hostile variable that needed to be permanently neutralized to ensure my survival. The woman he married was an apex predator. I looked at the clock. 3 in the morning. I picked up my phone and scrolled down to a number I had not dialed in 3 years. Victor Thorne was the most ruthless real estate attorney in Montana. He charged exorbitant fees because he never lost a corporate dispute. I called him. It rang twice. Victor did not sound asleep. Richard Victor said, his gravelly voice alert. You are calling me at 3 in the morning. You either killed someone or you are about to ask me to legally destroy someone. Which is it? Good morning, Victor, I replied. I need to retain your services immediately. I am facing a hostile takeover of my estate. Victor chuckled softly. Who is foolish enough to outmaneuver a structural engineer? My son and his wife, I stated. They forged my signature to secure a $2.5 million commercial loan against my 11 acres. The funds are currently sitting in escrow. They plan to declare me legally incompetent by the end of the month, seize medical power of attorney, and sell the land to a developer to cover an offshore debt. When Victor finally spoke, his tone had shifted to lethally professional. Do you have actionable proof? I have hours of high-definition audio recordings detailing their entire conspiracy, I replied. I installed military-grade micro-recorders throughout my home. I have their exact timeline. They are moving her bankrupt parents into my guest wing on the 28th to initiate the psychological stress test. Victor let out a low whistle. They are playing a dangerous game with the wrong man. Do you want me to contact the banking fraud department and block the escrow transfer tomorrow morning? We can have them arrested for wire fraud by noon. No, I said, my voice hardening into a cold, calculated edge. If we arrest them now, they will hire defense attorneys. They will claim it was a misunderstanding. They will drag this out in court for years. I do not want them to merely fail. I want them to hang themselves with their own rope. I want the bank to approve the loan. Let them think they have secured the capital. Victor paused. That is a massive risk, Richard. If that loan clears and you lose legal capacity, you are handing them a loaded weapon. What exactly is your endgame here? My endgame is complete annihilation, I said. I want to meet with you at your office tomorrow at 9 o'clock. We are going to exploit a local zoning loophole. I am going to legally subdivide this property, and we are going to sell the main house right out from under them before they can finalize their fraudulent paperwork. That is incredibly vindictive. Richard Victor observed, purring with professional excitement. A blind trust sale while the bank is holding their forged collateral. It is a legal masterpiece. It is structural necessity, I corrected him. You cannot leave a rotting beam in place. You extract it completely. I could hear the smile returning to Victor's face. Now you are speaking my language. I will have the zoning maps and the municipal codes ready by the time you arrive. Bring the audio files. We are going to build a very deep grave for your son. I will see you at 9 in the morning, I said softly, and ended the call. I set the phone down on the solid wood of my desk. The war had officially moved from the silent planning phase into a highly active, aggressive execution. They had foolishly handed me their exact operational deadline. The 28th of the month. I had exactly 3 short weeks to fully prepare the site. They truly believed they were bringing a Trojan horse into my peaceful sanctuary to completely destroy my life. They had absolutely no idea I was about to turn my entire estate into a highly engineered, inescapable prison from which they would never be able to recover. I pulled my truck into the private underground parking garage of Thorne and Associates just before 9 o'clock on Monday morning. The building was a sleek monolith of glass and steel situated in the wealthiest commercial district of Bozeman. Victor Thorne did not practice family law. He did not draft simple wills or handle minor neighborly disputes. Victor was a corporate litigator who specialized in hostile takeovers, complex land acquisitions, and dismantling people who believed they were untouchable. I walked into his corner office on the top floor. The space was intimidating by design, featuring dark mahogany walls and a massive desk that looked like a fortress. Victor was already seated, holding a thick manila file in his hands. He was a man in his late 50s, with sharp, predatory eyes and an immaculately tailored suit. We had crossed paths professionally decades ago during a massive commercial build in Chicago, and we shared a mutual respect rooted in cold efficiency. "Good morning, Richard," Victor said, gesturing to the heavy leather chair across from him. "I spent the weekend pulling every financial record attached to your property. You were absolutely correct. Your daughter-in-law is incredibly brazen." I sat down and unbuttoned my coat. "Show me the structural damage," I replied calmly. Victor opened the file and slid a stack of banking documents across the desk. "Valerie and Lucas submitted a comprehensive commercial loan application 13 days ago. They used your 11-acre estate as collateral for a $2.5 million line of credit. They provided the bank with your original property deed, your municipal tax assessments, and a brilliantly forged signature on the primary authorization forms." I picked up the papers. The forgery was indeed perfect. Valerie had traced the exact pressure and slant of my handwriting. To a banking underwriter, it looked entirely legitimate. "Where are the funds currently located?" I asked, maintaining a completely neutral tone. "The loan was tentatively approved late Friday afternoon," Victor answered, tapping his expensive pen against the desk. "The $2.5 million is currently sitting in a digital escrow account. The bank is simply waiting for the final notarized medical proxy and the secondary power of attorney signatures to release the capital directly into a joint account controlled by Lucas. They are inches away from the finish line." Victor leaned forward, his expression hardening into absolute authority. "I have the fraud department of the bank on speed dial. Give me the word, and I will freeze that escrow account within 3 minutes. I will have federal warrants issued for their arrest before you even finish your morning coffee. We can crush this right now." I looked down at the forged signature on the banking collateral form. If I stopped the loan now, I would merely be interrupting an attempt. Valerie would hire a defense attorney. She would claim she had my verbal permission. She would drag my name through the courts for years, spinning a narrative of a confused old man who forgot what he authorized. I did not want a prolonged legal skirmish. I wanted absolute, undeniable devastation. "No," I said smoothly. "Do not call the bank. Let the escrow account remain active. Let the underwriter finalize the internal approvals." Victor stopped tapping his pen. He stared at me, his sharp eyes narrowing in genuine surprise. "Richard, if that money leaves escrow and hits their account, they will immediately wire it offshore to cover their debts. You are handing a loaded gun to people who are actively trying to destroy you." "I am handing them a defective explosive, Victor," I corrected him. "In structural engineering, when you want to bring down a condemned building, you do not chip away at the exterior walls. You let the structure hold its own weight, while you quietly remove the central support columns. Then you let gravity do the work. If we stop the loan now, they face attempted fraud. But if we let the bank formally approve the collateral based on an asset they do not actually own the moment they try to execute that transaction, it instantly becomes federal wire fraud. I want the trap to snap shut permanently." A slow, dark smile spread across Victor's face. He leaned back in his leather chair, interlocking his fingers. "You want to sell the collateral right out from under them, while the bank is holding the paperwork," he murmured, processing the sheer malice of the strategy. "It is brilliant, but we need to move incredibly fast. You cannot just list a $3 million estate on the open market and close in 2 weeks." "I do not plan to list it on the open market," I replied, pulling a rolled architectural blueprint from my coat pocket and spreading it across his desk. "And I am not selling the entire estate. I am exploiting the local zoning ordinance." Victor leaned over the blueprint. I had spent Sunday night meticulously drafting the property boundaries. Bozeman zoning laws for this specific rural district allowed for accelerated residential subdivision as long as the secondary parcel maintained independent road access and its own water source. Look at the eastern boundary, I instructed, tracing my finger along the map. The property is 11 acres. I want you to legally subdivide this land immediately. I am carving out exactly 1 acre deep in the eastern pine woods. It connects to the old logging road and sits right above the secondary artesian well. That 1 acre will remain permanently in my name. I will build a small off-grid cabin there. Victor analyzed the dimensions, his legal mind moving at lightning speed. And the remaining 10 acres, he asked. The remaining 10 acres include the main house, the guest wing, the garage, and the primary driveway, I explained. That is the parcel Valerie and Lucas used for their forged commercial loan. I want you to package that 10-acre plot and sell it privately today. Victor looked at me, a low chuckle escaping his lips. Richard, finding a cash buyer willing to drop millions on a 10-acre estate in a matter of days without a standard inspection period is nearly impossible. It is entirely possible if you know exactly who to call, I stated coldly. You represent Harrison Cole, do you not? The mention of the notorious commercial developer made Victor pause. Harrison Cole was a ruthless real estate tycoon who specialized in buying prime Montana land, bulldozing existing structures, and building aggressive corporate resorts. He was hated by the locals, but revered by his investors. I do represent him, Victor said cautiously. But Harrison does not buy residential homes. He buys raw land for commercial development. Then tell him I am selling him 10 acres of prime, buildable land for $4 million cash. I replied, my voice steady and completely unyielding. Tell him he can have the property at a discount, but the deal comes with a mandatory demolition clause. He must bring his commercial excavators and physically bulldoze my $2 million house on the exact 28th of this month. Victor stared at the blueprint, perfectly understanding my design. The 28th, Victor whispered silently. Exactly, I said, leaning back in my chair. I need you to arrange a meeting with Harrison Cole this afternoon. Tell him a highly motivated seller holds 10 acres of prime unzoned land directly adjacent to the new highway extension, and I am willing to bypass the open market if he can move capital today. Victor did not waste a single second. He picked up his desk phone, dialed a private number, and spoke in low, rapid sentences. Within 5 minutes, the meeting was set. Harrison Cole was a man whose reputation preceded him across the entire state of Montana. He was known for buying distressed family farms, flattening them within weeks, and pouring concrete over local history to build massive soulless shopping complexes and corporate retreats. Most residents despised him. They saw him as a corporate vulture. But to me, sitting in that leather chair with my audio files securely backed up, Harrison Cole was not a vulture. He was a highly efficient, heavy-duty demolition tool. I was about to rent his lack of morality to execute a perfectly legal surgical strike on my own family. We drove to his corporate headquarters on the other side of town. The building was a testament to brutalist architecture, all sharp, unforgiving angles and heavy tinted glass. We were escorted into a massive boardroom overlooking the valley. Harrison Cole entered a few moments later. He was a large, imposing man, wearing a custom suit that could not quite hide his heavy build, with a predatory smile that he used to disarm desperate sellers. He shook Victor by the hand, and then turned to me, offering a firm, overly familiar grip. Mr. Richard Caldwell Harrison said, taking a seat at the head of the long, polished table. Victor tells me you are sitting on 10 acres of prime real estate, just off the main commercial artery, and you want to unload it quietly. I usually do not close deals in a single afternoon without sending my own topographical teams out there first. Why the sudden rush? Are you running from the bank? I opened my briefcase and pulled out the freshly stamped municipal survey documents, laying them flat on the table. I am certainly not running from the bank, Harrison, I replied evenly. I am simply a man who values absolute efficiency. You do not need to send a topographical team because my daughter-in-law generously hired one for you last week. Here are the expedited commercial boundaries, complete with soil density reports and elevation grades. The land is completely viable for heavy commercial development. Harrison picked up the survey maps. His eyes scanned the data, his predatory smile faltering slightly as he realized he was not dealing with a confused, desperate retiree. He looked at the municipal stamps verifying their authenticity. This is highly classified zoning data, he noted, looking back up at me. You have an 11-acre plot here, but the survey only highlights 10. I am keeping 1 acre deep in the eastern timberline, I explained smoothly. It has already been legally subdivided and recorded with the county clerk as of this morning. You are looking at the remaining 10 acres. It includes a $2 million custom-built log home, a 3-car garage, and direct access to the county highway. The market value of the raw land alone is roughly $5 million. I am offering it to you today for $4 million in pure cash. Harrison set the papers down. His business instincts were immediately triggered by the steep discount, but his suspicion was equally aroused. $4 million cash is not a problem for my firm, he said slowly, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the table. But men do not walk away from $1 million in pure equity just for the sake of efficiency. What is the catch, Richard? Are there environmental liens? Is the well poisoned? Is the foundation of the house sinking? There are absolutely no environmental liens, and the structural integrity of the home is completely flawless, I stated clearly. The catch is entirely procedural. If you want this property at a 20% discount, you must agree to 2 non-negotiable conditions. Harrison crossed his arms, waiting. First, I continued, the $4 million will not be wired into a standard personal account. It will be deposited immediately into an irrevocable blind trust managed entirely by Victor Thorne. The funds must be cleared and secured by the end of business today. Harrison nodded slowly. A blind trust is unusual for a simple property sale, but it is no skin off my back where the money goes as long as the title clears. What is the second condition? I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the polished wood. This is the structural core of the agreement, I said, ensuring my voice carried the heavy, immovable weight of absolute certainty. You are buying this property for the land, not the house. I know your firm specializes in aggressive commercial development. There, the contract will include a mandatory commercial demolition clause. You must bring your heavy excavators and completely flatten the primary residence, the garage, and all attached structures. You cannot salvage the home. You cannot flip it. You must destroy it down to the foundation. The silence that fell over the massive corporate boardroom was absolute, heavy with the weight of a multi-million-dollar transaction that defied all conventional real estate logic. The room itself was a monument to ruthless corporate efficiency wrapped in brutalist architecture, featuring unforgiving, sharp angles, heavy tinted glass, and a sprawling polished mahogany table that looked more like an executioner's block than a meeting space. Harrison Cole, a man who had built a massive fortune by preying on the desperation of financially ruined landowners, sat frozen at the head of the table. His usual predatory smirk, the one he used to disarm and intimidate weeping families as he bought their generational farms for pennies on the dollar, had entirely vanished, replaced by a look of profound, calculating bewilderment. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, his sharp eyes darting between the expedited municipal zoning surveys, the flawless soil density reports, and my completely unreadable stoic expression. He was a predator who was accustomed to smelling blood in the water. He was used to sellers begging for extended timelines, pleading for a few extra weeks to pack their precious memories, or asking him to preserve a historic barn or a sentimental garden. He had never in his entire ruthless career encountered a seller who utilized an irrevocable blind trust to instantly shield the liquid assets whilst simultaneously demanding the absolute mechanized obliteration of their own $2 million luxury estate. The concept of the mandatory commercial demolition clause was a legal masterpiece of pure weaponized malice. By legally binding his corporation to drive heavy excavators Through my front doors at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, on the 28th of the month, I was completely removing any possibility of human hesitation or legal delays. I was transforming Harrison Cole's massive soulless development firm into my own personal, highly efficient wrecking ball. He stared at the blueprints, his mind racing to find the hidden trapdoor in the contract, trying to decipher what dark, twisted family warfare he was being drafted into. But the math was undeniable. $4 million in pure cash for 10 acres of prime highway. Adjacent commercial land was a 20% market discount he simply could not refuse. I watched the gears turn in his head as he realized that while he might be the biggest shark in the Montana commercial real estate market, I was the engineer who had just designed the perfect, inescapable cage for his most violent instincts. I was renting his lack of morality to execute a flawless surgical strike, and he was more than happy to pull the trigger. Harrison looked genuinely perplexed. He was accustomed to sellers crying over the destruction of their family homes, begging him to preserve some small piece of their history. He had never met a seller who demanded the total destruction of their own property as a strict contractual obligation. "I can certainly bulldoze the house," Harrison said, a slight chuckle escaping his throat. "My crews love breaking things. We usually schedule demolition within 90 days of closing." "No," I corrected him, my gaze locking firmly onto his. "You will not schedule it within 90 days. You will schedule the demolition for the 28th of this exact month. Your heavy machinery will breach the front gates at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning on that specific day. Not a single minute sooner and not a single minute later. If you agree to that precise timeline, the 10 acres are yours." Harrison stared at me for a long time. He looked at Victor, who simply offered a cold, affirming nod. Harrison was a ruthless predator, and he recognized the sheer, unapologetic malice in my terms. He did not know who was moving into that house on the 28th, but he knew I was using his corporation as a massive legal weapon. He smiled, a genuine expression of dark respect. "I will have my legal team draft the contract immediately," Harrison said, extending his hand across the table. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the irrevocable blind trust was fully funded with $4 million. The deed was legally transferred to Harrison Cole. I walked out of the building with Victor feeling the crisp afternoon air against my face. The house no longer belonged to me. The trap was set in stone. Now I just had to drive back home and perfectly play the absolute fool. I turned the key in the ignition and left the commercial district of Bozeman behind. The drive back to the estate felt different this time. I was no longer a man defending his own territory. I was a ghost haunting a property that technically belonged to a corporate developer. The 10 acres and the massive log home were no longer my concern. My focus shifted entirely to the single acre of dense eastern timberline that I had secretly carved out of the municipal zoning maps. Over the next 2 weeks, I operated 2 completely separate lives. During the daylight hours when Lucas and Valerie were busy in the city running their fraudulent financial schemes, I was an architect executing a rapid construction project. I called in favors from a dozen retired union contractors I had worked with over the last 4 decades. Men who knew how to pour a foundation, run electrical wiring, and keep their mouths completely shut. Because my 1-acre plot had independent access through an old forgotten logging road, my crews never had to drive past the main house. We worked with militaristic efficiency. We did not build a traditional house from the ground up. I ordered a high-end prefabricated modular cabin heavily insulated for Montana winters and had it delivered on flatbed trailers. We anchored it to a rapidly curing concrete foundation. I had an independent solar array installed on the southern roof, completely off the grid. We tapped into the secondary artesian well for fresh water and established a satellite connection for secure digital access. Within 14 days, I had a fully functional, highly secure command center hidden behind a wall of ancient pine trees. It was entirely invisible from the main estate. The physical labor required to oversee the cabin's assembly was a welcome purification ritual. While Valerie and Lucas spent their days in the city frantically weaving a fragile digital web of forged signatures and offshore wire transfers, I was grounding myself in the undeniable reality of physics, mathematics, and raw materials. I personally inspected every load-bearing joint of the modular frame, ensuring the steel-reinforced brackets were torqued to the exact millimeter. We laid a specialized radiant-heated concrete slab, mathematically designed to absorb the sun's thermal energy during the harsh Montana afternoons and slowly release it throughout the freezing nights. I installed triple-pane argon-filled windows that completely neutralized the outside acoustics, ensuring my new sanctuary would remain a fortress of absolute impenetrable silence. Working alongside those grizzled union contractors brought a familiar calloused satisfaction back to my hands. It was the exact same honest, grueling work I had used to build the main estate decades ago alongside Martha. But this time, the architectural intent was fundamentally different. I was no longer building a sprawling family home designed to welcome future generations. I was engineering a highly specialized defensive redoubt. As I watched the final solar panels being locked securely onto the southern roofline, I realized that a structure is only as strong as the integrity of the materials used to build it. My son had chosen to build his life out of lies, toxic leverage, and parasitic entitlement, a pathetic house of cards, just waiting for a strong wind. I was building out of concrete steel and absolute truth. But as the sun began to set, each evening my construction crews would pack up their tools and leave. I would walk the half-mile through the woods back to the main house, wash the dirt from my hands, and step into my secondary role. I had to become the very thing Valerie needed me to be. I had to become an absolute liability to myself. I began laying the psychological groundwork with calculated precision. When they came to visit that first weekend, I made sure my performance was flawless. I started with minor infractions. I placed my truck keys inside the refrigerator next to the milk and spent 20 minutes frantically searching for them, intentionally allowing my hands to tremble. I called Lucas by the name of my late brother twice in one afternoon, correcting myself with a hollow, confused apology. The masterpiece of my performance, however, occurred on a Saturday evening. I placed a steel pot of water on the gas stove and simply let it boil. I sat in my leather armchair in the living room and watched the clock. I waited until the water completely evaporated and the metal bottom of the pot began to singe and smoke. I timed it perfectly to coincide with Valerie walking into the kitchen to pour her expensive, sparkling water. She shrieked, rushed to the stove, and killed the burner. She fanned the smoke away, her eyes wide with manufactured terror. She marched into the living room, holding the scorched pot like a piece of undeniable criminal evidence. "Dad." "What is the matter with you?" Valerie gasped, her voice trembling with theatrical panic. You left the stove burning on high. The water was completely gone. You could have burned this entire house down with all of us inside it." I looked up at her, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. I widened my eyes, projecting the hollow terror of a man losing his grip on reality. "I am so sorry, Valerie," I whispered, my voice incredibly frail. "I just wanted to make some tea." I sat down, and I completely forgot. I do not know what is happening to my memory lately. It is like a thick fog. Valerie set the ruined pot down on the coffee table. She knelt beside my chair, placing her hands over mine. I could feel the coldness of her skin. "It is okay, Dad," she cooed, slipping instantly into her patronizing maternal tone. "You are just tired. The doctor warned us that your mind might start playing tricks on you after the cardiac incident. This is exactly why Lucas and I are so worried about you living out here all alone. You need constant supervision. You are simply not safe by yourself anymore." I nodded slowly, looking down at the floor, playing the defeated victim. "You are right," I mumbled. "I am just so confused." Valerie patted my knee, her eyes shining with absolute predatory triumph. "Do not worry about a thing," she promised smoothly. "We are going to take care of everything. You just rest your mind." She stood up and walked down the hallway to find Lucas. I remained in my chair, staring at the wall until I was certain they were out of earshot. The frail, confused posture evaporated from my bones. I stood up, walked back to my locked private study, and opened the secure application on my phone. I activated the live audio feed from the micro recorder hidden inside the guest bedroom chandelier. I listened as Valerie closed the bedroom door. Her voice was buzzing with adrenaline. "Lucas, it is happening faster than we anticipated," she whispered aggressively. "He just left a pot burning on the stove. He completely forgot about it. He is slipping fast. The cognitive decline is textbook." I heard Lucas sigh heavily, the clinking of ice in his Scotch glass, betraying his perpetual anxiety. "Are you sure he is not just tired, Valerie?" he asked weakly. "If the bank requires a medical evaluation for the power of attorney, the doctor needs to see severe impairment." "He is severe, Lucas," she snapped back. "He called you by the wrong name yesterday. He put his keys in the refrigerator." The stress of my parents moving in is going to be the final nail in the coffin. He will fail the psychological evaluation spectacularly. We need to capitalize on this momentum right now. I heard the sound of her typing rapidly on her phone keyboard. "I am calling my parents," she announced. "I am telling them to pack the moving trucks immediately. We are moving their arrival date forward. They need to be here next week. We are locking the date for the 28th. I sat back in my heavy oak chair, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. The 28th. It was the exact date I had mandated in the commercial demolition contract with Harrison Cole. There was absolutely no way for them to escape the massive destruction they had blindly triggered. By manipulating her insatiable greed, I had seamlessly forced her to align her timeline perfectly with my execution schedule. The pieces were flawlessly locked into place. The fraudulent commercial bank loan was officially pending. The moving trucks were officially booked. My hidden woodland cabin was now fully operational. The enemy was marching directly onto the battlefield, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was entirely rigged with legal explosives. The morning of the 28th arrived with the heavy hum of diesel engines echoing up my gravel driveway. I stood in the kitchen holding a mug of black coffee, watching through the bay windows as two commercial moving trucks breached the iron gates of my estate. They were followed closely by a rented luxury sedan. The invasion had officially begun. I felt the cold, absolute certainty of a structural engineer watching a controlled demolition proceed according to the blueprint. The trap was locked. The sedan parked aggressively close to the front porch, tearing up the manicured edge of the lawn. Thomas and Susan Baxter stepped out. They were a masterclass in counterfeit wealth. Thomas wore a pristine golf polo and expensive loafers, projecting the aura of a man who owned a country club rather than a man recently evicted from his foreclosed home. Susan emerged wearing designer sunglasses. They stood in my driveway looking up at my log home, not with the gratitude of desperate refugees, but with the ravenous entitlement of conquering royalty. Lucas and Valerie pulled up seconds later. Valerie sprinted toward her parents, throwing her arms around them. Lucas lagged behind, his shoulders slumped, carrying a heavy briefcase that likely contained the forged commercial loan documents he planned to finalize once they had me locked in a psychiatric ward. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, maintaining my slow, shuffling, frail posture. "Good morning," I said, my voice intentionally weak. "You made excellent time on the drive up from California." Thomas did not offer his hand. He looked me up and down, his lips curling into a patronizing smile. He walked up the porch steps, brushing past me. "Open the main doors wide," Richard Thomas commanded, pulling a thick cigar from his shirt pocket. "The movers are paid by the hour, and we have an entire household of high-end furniture to unload. Do not stand in the walkways. We do not want you tripping and breaking a hip on our first day here." I stepped aside, keeping my expression perfectly blank as the moving crew filtered into the grand foyer. I did not want to watch Susan dictate the placement of her absurd Italian leather furniture. So I walked out the heavy front doors and stepped quietly back onto the wooden porch. I picked up Martha's cherry wood rocking chair, moved it to the far corner, and sat down with my ceramic coffee mug. Heavy footsteps approached the threshold a few moments later. Thomas Baxter stepped out onto the porch, leaving the door wide open behind him, so the chaotic symphony of Susan's arrogant demands echoed outside. He reached into the breast pocket of his pristine golf polo and extracted a thick, imported cigar. Snipping the end, he let the scrap of tobacco fall directly onto my clean porch floorboards. He struck a match, taking a deep draw, and blew a thick cloud of acrid gray smoke straight into the crisp Montana air. He looked at me with an expression of profound, unearned superiority. "Thanks for keeping the house warm for us, old man," Thomas said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But do not worry yourself about the property management anymore. I am taking the reins from here on out. We will set up a nice quiet cot for you down in the finished basement. You can just rest down there out of the way while we modernize the upper floors." He tapped his cigar against the wooden railing, intentionally letting the hot ash fall onto my boots. It was a blatant physical assertion of dominance from a man who had recently lost everything to foreclosure. I looked up at him, intentionally letting my jaw hang slightly slack to project a vacant, hollow confusion. "That sounds very practical, Thomas," I murmured, my voice shaking just enough to sound frail and defeated. "The stairs are getting very difficult anyway." Thomas let out a harsh laugh, patting my shoulder heavily. "You just stay out of the way of the professionals." He turned and sauntered back inside to join Valerie and Lucas, who were already popping champagne in the kitchen to celebrate their fraudulent victory. I remained in the cherry wood rocking chair, listening to the rhythmic creak of the wooden runners. I reached under the cuff of my jacket and looked at my heavy steel wristwatch. The polished hands swept smoothly across the dark dial. It was exactly 9:45 in the morning. 15 minutes is a very short amount of time in the grand scheme of a lifetime. But sitting there listening to them celebrate the theft of a $2.5 million fortune secured against a property they didn't even own, every second felt like an eternity. I looked down at my hands. They were perfectly steady. At exactly 9:58 in the morning, the atmosphere around the estate began to fundamentally change. It started not as a clear sound, but as a deep rhythmic vibration that I could feel transferring through the wooden floorboards of the porch and directly into the soles of my heavy work boots. The black coffee in my ceramic mug began to ripple slightly in concentric circles. Then came the undeniable noise. It was the unmistakable guttural roar of heavy industrial diesel engines echoing through the quiet mountain valley. It was not the high-pitched whine of commercial moving trucks backing up. This was the mechanical growl of massive earth-moving equipment. I looked down the long gravel driveway toward the main iron gates. The tall pine trees lining the road seemed to part, and then the first vehicle came into full view. It was a black Mercedes sedan, polished to a mirror finish, gliding smoothly over the uneven terrain. Directly behind the luxury sedan were two heavily armored county sheriff utility vehicles, their light bars flashing a blinding sequence of red and blue against the overcast Montana sky. But it was what followed the police escort that truly cast a dark shadow over the entire morning. 3 colossal bright yellow excavators rolled heavily through the reinforced gates. They were absolute monsters of modern engineering, equipped with massive steel demolition claws designed to crush thick concrete and shear through heavy wooden support beams like fragile paper. They moved with a terrifying, unstoppable momentum, their heavy metal tracks grinding the manicured gravel driveway into a fine white dust. The sheer size of the machinery cast long, dark shadows across the vibrant green grass of the front lawn. The convoy did not park respectfully near the outer edge of the property boundary. The black Mercedes pulled straight up to the front walkway, completely blocking in Valerie's leased luxury SUV. The 2 sheriff vehicles flanked the outer perimeter, effectively sealing off the only exit route from the estate. The 3 yellow excavators formed a tight semicircle facing the primary structure of the log house, their massive engines idling with a deafening, vibrating roar that completely drowned out the pleasant chirping of the morning birds. The moving crew, who had been carrying a heavy leather sofa up the front steps, immediately froze in their tracks. They lowered the expensive furniture onto the damp grass, their eyes wide with confusion and rising panic as they looked at the demolition clause suspended directly above the main roofline. The heavy front door of the house flew open with a violent crash. Susan stormed out onto the porch, her face flushed bright red with absolute indignation. She marched right past me without a single glance, stomping her heels down the wooden steps and walking straight toward the black Mercedes. "What is the meaning of this blatant disruption?" Susan screamed, waving her arms frantically over her head. "Turn those deafening machines off right this instant. We are trying to move into our new home, and you are kicking up hazardous dirt all over my extremely expensive Italian leather furniture. Turn them off before I call the local authorities and have you all arrested for trespassing." Her arrogant, demanding words were entirely swallowed by the mechanical roar of the idling excavators. The driver's side door of the Mercedes opened smoothly. A tall, sharply dressed man clutching a thick leather briefcase stepped out into the driveway. I was Harrison Cole's primary corporate litigator. Two uniformed sheriff deputies stepped out of their vehicles simultaneously, resting their hands casually near their duty belts. The heavy, intimidating presence of armed law enforcement instantly shattered Susan's false bravado. She took a rapid step backward, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process the sheer, overwhelming scale of the mechanical intrusion. Valerie burst through the front door a few seconds later, followed closely by a hyperventilating Lucas. Valerie sprinted past her mother, her face completely pale, but twisted in desperate, uncontrollable anger. In her right hand, she clutched a thick stack of printed banking documents. It was the forged commercial collateral paperwork she firmly believed granted her absolute legal authority over my entire estate. "What do you think you are doing on my property?" Valerie shrieked at the corporate lawyer. Her voice was incredibly shrill, cracking under the intense, escalating pressure of the chaotic moment. "You have absolutely no right to bring commercial demolition equipment onto this residential land. I demand that you turn your trucks around and leave immediately. I have the highly classified legal paperwork right here in my hand. We hold a $2.5 million commercial mortgage on this entire estate. The banking underwriter just approved the property collateral this morning. This is our legal house now, and you are illegally trespassing on private land." The corporate lawyer calmly adjusted his expensive suit jacket. He looked at Valerie with the cold, detached amusement of a seasoned predator observing a cornered, desperate animal. He opened his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a single, heavily stamped legal document. He did not raise his voice or match her frantic, screaming energy. He simply walked forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed the thick, high-quality paper directly against Valerie's chest. Lucas stood paralyzed on the top step of the porch. His hands gripped the wooden railing so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He looked at the massive yellow excavators and the armed sheriff deputies with a profound look of absolute terror. He was slowly realizing that the pristine illusion of their criminal masterpiece was rapidly crumbling into dust. I remained seated in my cherry-wood rocking chair, completely motionless and entirely silent. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The bitter liquid tasted incredibly sweet in that specific moment. The trap had officially sprung shut. The crushing weight of absolute accountability was finally descending upon them. There was absolutely nowhere left for them to run or hide. The corporate attorney did not blink as Valerie screamed at him. He possessed the icy demeanor of a man who dismantled empires for a living. He looked at the frantic woman waving her fraudulent applications and simply shook his head. "Madam," he said, his voice cutting through the heavy morning air with absolute authority. "Those papers you are holding are entirely worthless. You do not hold a commercial mortgage on this estate because the man you are trying to steal it from no longer owns it." He raised the thick, watermarked document he had pulled from his briefcase and pressed it firmly against her chest. Valerie reflexively grabbed the paper, her eyes darting across the legal text. This property was sold legally and transferred into an irrevocable blind trust exactly 3 weeks ago. The lawyer continued stepping back to stand shoulder to shoulder with the armed sheriff deputies. My client, Harrison Cole, is the sole legal owner of these 10 acres and all attached structures. Today is the contractually mandated demolition day. You are currently trespassing on an active commercial construction site. You have exactly 15 minutes to remove yourselves and your vehicles from the premises before my operators start those excavators and drive them straight through that front door. Valerie stared at the deed in her hands. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and entirely terrified. I watched her eyes lock onto the date of the sale, the date of the municipal transfer, and the official seal of the county clerk. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The pristine, impenetrable fortress of her arrogance had just suffered a catastrophic structural failure. Susan, however, was not intelligent enough to comprehend the legal reality of the situation. She stepped forward, pointing an accusing finger at the attorney. "This is completely unacceptable." Susan shrieked, her voice echoing off the log cabin walls. "We have expensive Italian furniture sitting in that living room. We are not moving anywhere. Thomas, do something. Tell these thugs to leave." Thomas Baxter, the man who had confidently smoked a cigar on my porch just minutes prior, did absolutely nothing. He looked at the two armed deputies, then at the massive yellow bulldozers idling in the driveway, and slowly backed away. His false bravado evaporated the moment he faced actual consequences. He was a coward exactly like his son-in-law. Lucas finally moved. He stumbled down the porch steps, his legs visibly shaking. He grabbed the deed from Valerie's hands, his eyes frantically scanning the paragraphs. He read the dates, the transfer of ownership, and the final sale price. The reality of his situation crashed into him with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. He dropped the paper into the damp grass. He spun around and looked up at me sitting on the porch. He still believed I was the frail, confused old man they had been manipulating for months. He thought I had simply made a terrible, senile mistake that had ruined their perfect plan. Dad, Lucas yelled, his voice cracking with absolute raw panic. "Dad, what did you do? You cannot sell this house. The bank just wired the $2.5 million commercial loan against this property this morning. The funds just hit the escrow account. If the bank finds out the collateral is gone, they will demand the money back immediately. We do not have the money, Dad. We already sent it offshore to pay our private lenders. You have to stop this right now." I sat in Martha's cherry wood rocking chair for one final moment. I let his desperate, pleading words hang in the cold morning air. Then I wrapped my hands around the wooden armrests and stood up. I did not shuffle. I did not lean forward or let my shoulders slump. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back and locking my posture into the rigid, immovable stance of a master structural engineer. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. The vacant, confused fog that had clouded my eyes, for the last 3 weeks, evaporated, replaced by a cold, piercing, and absolutely lethal clarity. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked down at my son. "Yes, Lucas," I said, my voice projecting across the driveway, with a deep, steady resonance that completely silenced the idle chatter of the moving crew. "I know the bank wired the funds this morning. And since I sold this house legally 3 weeks ago, you and your wife just used an asset you do not own to secure a $2.5 million bank loan." I let the silence stretch for a fraction of a second, ensuring the weight of my words crushed whatever remaining hope they held. "You forged my signature to steal my estate." I continued, speaking with the cold precision of a falling blade. "But by executing that final banking transfer this morning, you crossed a very rigid legal boundary. The FBI calls that federal wire fraud. And because you transferred those fraudulent funds to an offshore account to cover your illicit debts, you have also triggered federal money laundering statutes." Valerie let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She stumbled backward, bumping into the side of her leased luxury vehicle. She finally understood. The entire timeline of their conspiracy had not been dictated by their own clever planning. It had been meticulously engineered by me. I had orchestrated every single variable. I had let them believe they were successfully gaslighting me. I had allowed them to search my private study. I had permitted them to bring her bankrupt parents into my home, to create the illusion of a hostile takeover. I had played the senile fool watching them dig a trench so deep they could never climb out. I had patiently waited for them to sign the final irreversible banking documents before I triggered the demolition. Lucas fell to his knees in the damp gravel. The expensive fabric of his trousers absorbed the dirty water, but he did not seem to notice or care. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. "You knew," Lucas whispered, his voice completely broken. "You knew everything the entire time. You set us up." "I did not set you up, Lucas," I replied, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "I simply provided you with enough rope to hang yourself, and you tied the knot with your own 2 hands. You invited parasites into my home. You planned to drug me, declare me incompetent, and lock me in a state-funded ward to rot so you could steal my life's work. You forgot that I spent my entire career designing structures to withstand massive external pressure. When I detected the rot inside my own family, I did not try to repair it. I engineered a controlled demolition to eradicate the threat completely. I looked past my son, turning my attention to the corporate lawyer, standing near the black Mercedes. The attorney offered a slow, deeply respectful nod, acknowledging the sheer brutality of the trap I had built. He turned his attention back to Valerie and the terrified Baxter family. "You now have 12 minutes to remove yourselves from this property," the attorney announced, checking his expensive wristwatch. "If you are still standing on this gravel when the clock strikes 10, the sheriff deputies will arrest you for criminal trespassing, and my operators will drive those excavators directly over your vehicles." Susan let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She turned and sprinted toward the moving trucks, wildly commanding the movers to start pulling her expensive Italian furniture back out of my living room. But the movers had already seen enough. The foreman shook his head, signaled his crew, and they immediately began walking away from the house, refusing to get involved in a federal crime scene. The beautiful, chaotic symphony of their absolute destruction was finally reaching its crescendo, and I had a front-row seat to the entire collapse. The clock struck 10. The corporate attorney raised his hand and gave a sharp downward signal to the foreman of the demolition crew. The deafening roar of the 3 yellow excavators surged as the operators engaged the hydraulic drives. The massive metal tracks ground forward, chewing through the pristine landscaping. Susan shrieked, collapsing into the muddy grass as the lead excavator drove its massive steel claw straight through the vaulted glass windows of the grand living room. The sound of shattering glass and splintering timber echoed like a bomb blast across the valley. The claw retracted and swung again, tearing away the entire eastern wall. The roofline groaned under the sudden loss of structural support. The heavy log beams, which I had personally inspected and installed decades ago, cracked and gave way. The second excavator moved into position, its heavy bucket smashing directly into the space Susan had designated for her Italian leather sectionals. The pristine white furniture was instantly pulverized under tons of falling drywall and shattered roofing tiles. The third machine tore through the guest wing, ripping the antique chandelier from the ceiling and crushing the mahogany armoire Valerie had despised. Decades of careful craftsmanship were reduced to a chaotic pile of industrial debris within minutes. I watched the destruction with an absolute, undisturbed calm. There was no nostalgia or regret in my heart. A house is simply a collection of woodstone and nails. It only becomes a home when it is filled with respect and loyalty. The moment my son and his wife decided to turn this structure into a financial weapon against my sanity, the building lost all value to me. It was merely a contaminated shell. Seeing it mechanically obliterated felt like watching a surgeon expertly remove a malignant tumor. The air was thick with gray dust, smelling of pulverized concrete and crushed pine. Valerie fell to her knees beside her mother, clutching her head and sobbing hysterically. Her perfect lifestyle facade had completely vanished, replaced by the raw, ugly reality of absolute failure. She watched the excavator crush the guest suite, knowing that her bankrupt parents now had absolutely nowhere to sleep. Thomas Baxter stood frozen by the luxury sedan, his jaw hanging slack, completely impotent, as the dust coated his expensive golf shirt. The entire illusion of their wealth and superiority was buried under the rubble of a house they had tried to steal but never truly owned. They had gambled everything and lost. Lucas was still on his knees in the driveway, hyperventilating, as the gravity of his situation tightened around his throat. He looked at the armed sheriff deputies, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope that they might intervene to save him. But the deputies were not there to protect a fraudulent loan. The lead officer stepped forward, unhooking his radio. He approached my son, his hand resting firmly on his utility belt. The officer looked down at Lucas, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy. The corporate attorney had already handed the deputy the confirmed digital wire transfer records from the bank. "Lucas Caldwell." The deputy said, his voice loud enough to cut through the grinding roar of the demolition equipment. "We received a direct communication from the banking fraud department 10 minutes ago. You and your wife are being placed under arrest for suspicion of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Lucas let out a pathetic, broken whimper. He did not fight. He lacked the spine to offer any physical resistance. He simply allowed the deputy to pull his arms back and secure the steel handcuffs. Valerie saw the handcuffs and completely lost whatever fraction of sanity she had left. She lunged toward the deputies, screaming that it was all a misunderstanding, that I had given them verbal permission, that they were simply trying to protect their family. The second deputy intercepted her swiftly, spinning her around and locking the metal cuffs around her wrists. Her shrill cries mixed with the violent crunching of the excavators tearing down the final support columns of the roof. She was a master manipulator, but no amount of gaslighting could talk her out of a federal indictment with confirmed digital banking evidence. I remained on the edge of the porch as the deputies marched my son and my daughter-in-law toward the back of the patrol vehicles. Lucas stopped for a fraction of a second and looked over his shoulder. He looked at me with eyes full of a desperate, silent plea for paternal rescue. He wanted me to save him from the consequences of his own treason. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply looked back at him with the cold, immovable gaze of a man who had successfully eliminated a severe structural liability. They were shoved into the back of the squad cars, the heavy doors slamming shut and sealing their fate. The deputies climbed into the front seats, activated their sirens, and drove down the gravel path, taking the toxic remnants of my family away from my property forever. Thomas and Susan Baxter were left standing in the driveway, completely alone, covered in dust, staring at the ruins of their stolen sanctuary. The corporate attorney approached them, offering a sharp, unsympathetic warning to remove their vehicle before the debris removal trucks arrived. They scrambled into their sedan and fled without looking back. I turned away from the destruction. I walked around the edge of the demolition zone, stepping over a broken piece of the front porch railing. I moved toward the eastern timberline, leaving the noise of the excavators behind me. I walked down the hidden logging road, the dense pine trees immediately swallowing the sounds of the heavy machinery. A deep, profound silence wrapped around my shoulders. After a half-mile, the trees opened to reveal my new sanctuary, the modern, off-grid cabin sat perfectly nestled in the woods, entirely self-sufficient, absolutely secure, pure and legally insulated from the outside world. I walked inside my home, poured a hot cup of fresh black coffee, and sat down. I had $4 million, and I finally had absolute unbreakable peace. That first evening in the new cabin was a masterclass in profound tranquility. As the sun dipped below the jagged Montana peaks, casting long violet shadows across the dense timberline, I lit a small fire in the cast-iron wood stove. The rich, earthy scent of burning pine filled the compact, impeccably designed space. I sat in my leather armchair the only piece of furniture I had quietly moved from the main house weeks prior, and listened to the absolute stillness of the forest. There were no shrill complaints from Susan, no arrogant cigar smoke from Thomas, and no suffocating manufactured sympathy from Valerie. More importantly, the crushing invisible weight of my son's cowardice was entirely gone from my life. The emotional amputation was complete, and the wound had already been cleanly cauterized by logic. I poured myself a single glass of aged bourbon, raising it silently, in the flickering firelight, to Martha's memory. She had warned me about the vulture circling our family, and I had successfully protected our nest by burning it entirely to the ground. I walked over to my drafting table, unrolling a fresh, pristine sheet of heavy blueprint paper. I was 76 years old, in perfect health, with $4 million sitting securely in an irrevocable trust. It was time to start designing a new legacy, perhaps an engineering scholarship fund in Martha's name for young kids who actually wanted to build something real with their own two hands. The massive demolition of my past was merely the site preparation for my future. There is a dangerous misconception that the silence of an old man equates to weakness. People assume that because we have gray hair, we have lost our bite. But they forget that those of us who spent our lives building steel bridges and skyscrapers know exactly where to place the explosive charge to bring the whole structure down. Family is not determined by blood. It is determined by respect. When someone plots to steal your dignity, you owe them no mercy. Protect your peace, trust your intellect, and never ever let anyone make you a victim in your own home. Did this story resonate with you? Have you ever had to protect yourself from the greed of your own family? Let me know in the comments below. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Your support keeps these stories alive, with love and respect.